Friends, implications of local, state, and federal U.S. immigration policy. Dr. Gelatt previously worked as a research associate at the Urban Institute, where her mixed methods research focused on state policies toward immigrants, barriers to and facilitators of immigrant families' access to public benefits and public pre-kindergarten programs, and identifying youth victims of human trafficking. She was a research assistant at MPI before graduate school. Dr. Gelatt earned her PhD in sociology with a specialization in demography from Princeton University, where her work focused on the relationship between immigration status and children's health and well-being. She earned a Bachelor of the Arts in Sociology and Anthropology from Carleton College. So, Dr. Gelatt, we're very pleased to have you with us today, and I'm going to adjust the view on this so that we can hopefully see your face. Sorry, pardon me. One moment.
It should switch when it starts.
Okay, okay. Great, and I will turn it over to you. Round of applause, please, for Dr.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thanks so much for having me. Wish I could be there with you in person, but it's great to be joining you all virtually. I'm going to talk today about kind of some of the new trends that we're seeing in U.S. immigration, bringing in legal immigrants as well as unauthorized immigrants, and then share a little bit about the patchwork of good and bad and in between data that we have to understand these trends. Okay, first, just a quick word about the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We do research, we do policy analysis, we put forward policy recommendations, we do a lot of talking to the press and various public audiences, and we also convene stakeholders and policymakers to talk about how immigration policies and immigrant integration policies can be better managed. We also have the Migration Data Hub, which I like to point out. It's a great source of all kinds of data on US immigration, characteristics of immigrant populations, and also global migration trends. We have a lot of Census Bureau data that we try to put together in easy to use ways. So what are some of the new or suspected immigration trends that we're seeing in the United States today? Because we really are in a period of change in US immigration. The pandemic really disrupted immigration, but we're also seeing a new globalization of immigration and other different trends. So one thing that we think is true, or that seems to be true, is that immigration is higher now on total than it was pre-pandemic. But I put the question mark there because we'll look at what we know and what we don't know about that. There are growing numbers of temporary immigrants coming to the United States, or maybe numbers of temporary immigrants are staying longer in the United States, building up this population. That's mostly temporary workers, also international students and others. We have a new pathway to the United States. It's not exactly new, but its use is kind of novel in allowing in large numbers of immigrants through something called humanitarian parole. And then I know you've heard a lot about unauthorized immigrants. We're seeing, of course, really high numbers of people coming to the US-Mexico border. What do those dynamics look like, and how many of those new entrants are likely to stay? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So starting with legal immigration, there's so much attention these days to unauthorized immigrants that I always like to bring legal immigrants into the picture. So this graph is showing the number of legal permanent immigrants who are newly coming to the United States each year from abroad by fiscal year. The number of new permanent residents coming from abroad peaked in 2016, and then there was a sharp decrease during the pandemic when travel and processing was disrupted, and then we've seen a pretty strong rebound into last fiscal year. We have good data on how many people are granted permanent residence in the United States. The easy thing about permanent immigrants is that they tend to come and stay. Of course, over time they may leave, over time they may die, but it's pretty easy to measure when new permanent residents join our population. We also have okay data on temporary immigration. So legal temporary immigration, it looks kind of similar to that last graph. The peak was a year earlier. Temporary immigration fell very sharply during the pandemic and has rebounded to one of the highest levels that we've ever seen in terms of temporary immigrants coming. In this graph, I'm just looking at temporary immigrants who have a longer US duration. So we know millions of people come to the US on a tourist visa for vacation, for a conference, and leave very quickly. But these are issuances of temporary visas for people in categories that usually lead to a longer stay. So again, international students are in here, temporary workers are in here. Those are the main groups, a small number of diplomats and some others. We don't have data, we don't have great data to know how many temporary immigrants join our population directly, but we have data on how many temporary visas are issued. Most people, at least in these longer duration categories, don't get more than one temporary visa per year, so it's a pretty good proxy. Some people get a visa issued and don't use it. Some people are issued a visa, they don't use it till the next year, but it's a decent measure. And then, of course, border apprehensions are very high, and they're often described as unprecedented, and in some ways they are. In other ways, it depends what you're trying to measure, because the number of people coming in across the border likely is lower today than it has been at some past periods. So this graph is showing the number of border apprehensions between ports of entry. So for the border, one of the most immediate statistics that we get is based on events rather than people, how many apprehensions there are. There was a peak of 1.6 million back in the year 2000, and then we've seen numbers over 2 million in recent years. Some of these bars are half purple or partially purple. That's indicating people or encounters that led to a quick expulsion under Title 42. So Title 42 was a policy in place during the COVID-19 pandemic. It allowed border authorities to very quickly turn people right back around to Mexico, or to be detained and then flown to their home country with very little processing. A lot of people who entered and were expelled under Title 42 tried to enter again. So recidivism, repeat crossing rates were higher in this period. So part of the reason that the apprehension numbers are higher is that people were trying more times to come into the United States. And part of it is that many, many people were approaching the border. But back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a lot of people who were coming to the US-Mexico border were trying to sneak across the border undetected into the United States. Today, many people are coming and wishing to seek humanitarian protection. And so they cross the border and then they seek out a border authority in order to present themselves for processing. So evidence suggests that back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were more people who crossed the border undetected who didn't show up in these numbers, whereas today a larger share of people who cross the border are detected. So there's a discrepancy between the number of apprehensions and the number of people actually entering. So in addition to legal immigration and illegal immigration, there has in recent years been high use of something called humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole entered US immigration law in the 50s. It allows the executive branch the power to let in people across a border or at an airport who don't have a visa for a valid entry. It was initially used in the 50s, 60s, 70s to allow in refugees before we had a formal refugee program. After that, it was used in more limited numbers for people who had some kind of really urgent situation, like they needed a life-saving medical treatment that was available in the United States and not in their home country, or they're coming to the United States to participate as an important witness in a trial. Under the Biden administration, there's been very broad use of humanitarian parole in multiple different ways. So last year, the administration created the CBP-1 process where migrants who wish to come to the United States across the border and seek protection could make an appointment at a port of entry through a smartphone app, wait for that appointment, and then be considered for parole. Over 591,000 people have made appointments so far, and we don't know exactly how many have been granted parole, but likely the great majority of them have. There's also a parole program that was set up for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans called CHNV parole. Over 400,000 migrants have come in through that program. There's another parole program for Ukrainians that was set up after the Russian invasion. Over 200,000 migrants have been paroled in through that program. And then after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban takeover, about 75,000 Afghans, more or less, were allowed into the United States through parole. So in sum, well over 1 million people have come into the United States through humanitarian parole under the Biden administration. So that's adding to the immigrant inflows on top of our legal immigration and illegal immigration pathways that we've long had. Of course, you all know that inflows do not equate to the growth in the immigrant population, but I'm sad to say that in Washington, D.C., there are a whole lot of people in the media, in Congress, in hotly debated immigration conversations that tend to talk about the number of people who have come into the United States under President Biden as all of those people growing our immigrant population. Of course, there are offsetting factors, right? So we know that the Mexican immigrant population has been declining over the past decade or so. That's a combination of how many people choose to come, but also deportations, voluntary immigration, and deaths. Because the Mexican immigrant population is very large, that decrease is offsetting some of the inflows. We also have immigrant populations. The pink line is showing Salvadoran immigrants and the number by decade. So we also have immigrant populations like Salvadorans that had been growing fairly quickly, but then flattened out due to a variety of push and pull factors that changed. And then there are some longer term immigrant populations, especially European immigrants, where those populations are in decline. Many of the European immigrants came decades and decades ago, and some of them are dying. And that population is not being offset by new inflows. So there are some key factors that shape the relationship, of course, between inflows of immigrants and then growth of the foreign-born population. So these relate to how many border entrants are quickly removed. We know that millions of migrants are being apprehended at the border. I already told you that some of them were very quickly turned back under Title 42. Others were initially allowed in, but may have been quickly removed through other processes. And the rest are in removal proceedings. So how long are they able to stay? Another factor that shapes this relationship between new inflows and the growth in the stock is how many recent border entrants will be able to obtain long-term legal status, such as through asylum, and be more likely to stay in the United States, and then how many will fail to obtain legal status but may stay in the United States anyway for the long term. How many longer term unauthorized immigrants will choose to emigrate or be deported, and that's true for longer term immigrants generally. And how long do these growing numbers of temporary immigrants stay in the United States? So we have answers to some of these questions, patchy answers, and we don't have any answer to some of them. In terms of border entrants, how many are quickly removed? We have some information that comes from the statistics office within DHS that does good work, but they haven't publicly released a report on new border entrant cohorts and how many are able to stay in several years. Instead, what we have are some numbers that were released as part of a quite political House of Representatives report on immigration under the Biden administration. So basically some leaked numbers. And what those said was that between January of 2021, when President Biden took office, and last September, over 6 million migrants were encountered at the US-Mexico border. And of those, over 3.1 million had no confirmed departure. So some of the other 3 million were quickly turned around under Title 42. Some of them were put through a process called expedited removal, which takes days or weeks. Some of them were put into longer term removal proceedings. Some of those had quick answers, and many of those people are still in the United States. Over 3.1 million had not departed. In terms of how many of the recent border entrants may be able to obtain legal status that allows them to stay legally in the United States, making them more likely to stay long term, we don't really know. We have some data on asylum decisions in immigration court, but because there's such a lag between when people apply for asylum and when they get their decision, and because a lot of cases are being closed without any decision, it's really hard to guess of the people who are applying for asylum today who came across the border, what share of them will be successful in their asylum applications. We have some hints, though, in the fact that the national origins of border migrants are shifting. So for a long time, most of the people coming to the US-Mexico border and entering without authorization were from Mexico. And people from Mexico are usually pretty unsuccessful in obtaining asylum in the United States. And many of those border crossers haven't had a way to obtain legal status in the United States since 1986. But in more recent years, we've seen more Central American families. That was very common in 2019, coming to the United States, fleeing gang violence, domestic violence, other difficult situations at home. Some of those families have so far been successful in their asylum claims, others have not. The exact rules around those types of asylum claims have shifted a bit over time. More recently, we've seen more border migrants coming from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but also the rest of the world. That's the blue part of the bar at the top, people from beyond Mexico, North and Central America, and then those 4 countries that we saw a lot of growth in. The rest of the world is a very diverse set of people. There's growing numbers from Colombia and Ecuador, but also people coming from further afield, from China, from India, from Cameroon, from Russia, from Afghanistan, many, many countries for many, many different reasons. People who are fleeing government repression are the most likely, they have the most clear-cut asylum cases, they're the most likely to win their cases. So it's likely that with this diversification of irregular migration, that people are more often coming from situations and from countries that align well with US asylum law, and they may be more successful. But that is a bit of a question mark of how many of the people who have come recently will eventually find a way to legal status through asylum or through some other means. In terms of longer-term immigrants and their emigration or deportation rates, we do have some estimates from Dr. Van Hook, who presented yesterday, and others of emigration rates. The Census Bureau tells us what they think net international migration is, but they don't share publicly, at least, what the emigration rate inherent in those calculations is. And then we have clear data on deportations. So we know that deportations of immigrants were quite high during the Obama administration, but during the last few years of the Obama administration were lower, as that administration chose to use more prosecutorial discretion. President Trump, of course, came into office promising very high deportations, but due to some state and local government decisions that limit the cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, deportations didn't rise as much as was promised or threatened. Under President Biden, we've seen so many of the immigration resources devoted to the border that deportations of longer-term residents are quite low. And then we'll have to see who wins the election and whether, if Trump wins, he has any ability to carry out the mass deportations that he's talked about, but there are real resource and policy constraints. And then finally, on temporary immigrants, how long do they stay in the United States? So the best way we have to look at whether there's a growing population of temporary immigrants is that the Department of Homeland Security Statistics Office does its own estimates of the stock of temporary immigrants, which are called non-immigrants. By fiscal year, they've only updated those to 2019. DHS has good administrative data on non-immigrants entering the United States and some data on exits. If people leave by plane or boat, those exits are pretty well tracked. If people are leaving across land borders, it's more difficult to measure. But through a mix of direct measurement and then modeling based on the expected duration of residence by temporary immigrants' country of origin and the type of the visa that they're on, they have put out these estimates and estimate that the non-immigrant population has grown from under 2 million to now over 3 million. And I believe that when we see the more recent estimates, it will be even higher. So there's a growing stock of temporary immigrants in the United States. This relates both to the number coming in, of course, and to how long they stay. Of course, we don't necessarily need to add up these administrative data inflows and then try to figure out how to subtract outflows, because we're lucky in the United States to have a good census and good annual survey in the American Community Survey to know what is the stock of the foreign-born population and how has that changed. But I wanted to present how we're in a little bit of a tricky moment in terms of data, because in a period of probably growth in the immigrant population, data lags become really important. So the American Community Survey, we have data through 2022. There's also the Census Bureau's current population survey, which is a smaller survey, but the data come out faster. So what I'm showing you here is the American Community Survey data by year, and then the CPS data using the March supplement, which has a larger sample size. That's the annual social and economic supplement. And you can see that there are some relatively small, but disagreements in the estimate of the size of the foreign-born population in each year. And that there's also been a flip in the order of which survey is estimating a larger or smaller population. But one thing that's important to note is that if you look at 2021 and 2022, the ACS is implying a net growth in the foreign-born population of under 1 million, of about 900,000, and the CPS is showing growth of about 1.7 million. So somebody is really interested in how fast the immigrant population is growing. There's now this disparity between the two data sets. And there's a lot of interest in DC and knowing what's been happening in the last couple of years. So that leads to a lot of temptation to use the CPS. But I always caution that the CPS has a smaller sample size. Those estimates can jump around more than the ACS estimates. The other reason that this has gotten heightened, this divergence, is that there's a question of whether the US is now at a record foreign-born share of our population. So at MPI, we tend to use the ACS. We've been saying that we're at a record high number of immigrants in the United States, but as of 2022, only 13.9% of the population was foreign-born, whereas back in 1890 was 14.8%. But again, if you use the CPS data, if the immigrant population is growing as quickly as the CPS would indicate, in 2023, we perhaps were at that historic high, and then the monthly CPS data indicated that in March we were at 15.6% foreign-born. So again, these are small differences. We all know that there's some sampling error here, that data are never perfect, but in policy conversations, these small differences can get magnified. Finally, I just wanted to present this graph, which is showing one of the benefits of the CPS, which I think was mentioned earlier, which is that it not only asks about respondents' place of birth, but also where their parents were born. And so that allows you to separate out first-generation immigrants, meaning foreign-born people, second-generation immigrants, which are the US-born children of immigrants, and then the third or higher generation US-born people with US-born parents. If you look at the change in the US population by millions between 2000 and 2020, what you can see is that all of the growth in the under age 55 population in the United States came from immigrants and their children. This is a picture that the CPS, with its extra question, allows us to see. And focusing on the prime working age population, you can see particularly that growth in that population is driven by children of immigrants, and that the third and higher generation of prime working age fell by 8 million over this period. Before I pause for questions, I just made this slide to remind myself to tell you all that MPI is currently accepting applications for our internship program for the fall. The deadline is July 1st, and would definitely encourage students to apply to join us for the internship. It comes with a stipend, and there are remote and in-person internship options available. With that, I would love to hear any questions that you have.
Julia?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so when you show the US data historically, it looked like there has been a difference between the ACS and CPS for some time, if I'm remembering right. Are there any theories about why that's true? Is it possible that people are more likely to respond to one of these surveys than the other for some reason?
So there is one big difference, which is that the group quarters, the group quarters population is captured in the ACS. Oh, this is not the right slide either, sorry. And not the CPS, but no, I've been meaning to ask friends at the Census Bureau to explain more if they know. I mean, I have always suspected that the ACS, it's better resource, it's a bigger sample, and has more language coverage of limited English proficient individuals, but that doesn't explain why there was that flip. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer there.
So I understand that the census is 10 years, but like for each 10 year, has there been comparison between these estimates and the census to see how much of a discrepancy exists between these estimates and the census?
So the American Community Survey is an annual survey, and the current population survey is actually a monthly survey with this larger sample in March. So, but you're asking about the decennial census and the comparisons there?
Yeah.
So, right, so I guess another factor here, and is that the American Community Survey is a sample, and then every 10 years, the government tries to count every single individual in the United States in the census. So the ACS sample is weighted to match the expected size of the US population, and that expected size of the US population starts with the decennial census, but then adjustments for expected births and deaths and net migration. So sometimes, and I think Jeff Bissell, who spoke with you yesterday, has looked at this more than anyone else I know, but sometimes there's a surprise. Like between 2000 and 2010, the Census Bureau had been projecting for the increase in the total US population and the foreign-born population, and then in 2010, in the decennial census, captured more people than they had expected to capture, or more people who might have been immigrants. So so that led to kind of a discontinuity in the numbers. So there is a relationship between the decennial census and the ACS, in that the ACS is weighted to the expected population, which is partly built on the decennial census. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. Any other last questions?
There's also a comment in the chat from Jenny Van Hook that answers that question.
Oh,
Or that addresses that question.
great.
Right. Yeah, so the decennial census doesn't have a question on place of birth, but I think, I'm trying to remember now if it was the Hispanic population. There was something that was a surprise about the size, but I think also just the total population can end up being what was different from what was expected from the components of change.
Thanks for that. Any other questions? Great. Oh, one more.
I have a clarification question, but it might be my ignorance, and please excuse me for that. How do you go from the survey sample to, because your title says estimate of the foreign-born population, like how do you go from the sample that is surveyed to the sample that you estimate is like in the population that is foreign-born? Do you do like network scaled up method or something similar to that? Can you tell a bit more about that? How does that work?
So the weights that are applied to the American Community Survey sample are based on a broad set of characteristics. I believe it's age and gender and race and ethnicity. So there's not a specific weight. Others can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there's no specific weight by foreign-born status. There's broad weights by these other demographic characteristics that are measured in both surveys.
I do have another question. The other category, when we were looking at across 2019 to 2023, it was becoming bigger and bigger, the acceptance rate for that other category. Do we have any understanding of who was in that other category when it comes to their, I think it was asylum claims that were yes, or yes.
Yeah, so this is showing the countries of nationality of migrants. It's actually of encounters, not of people, but of encounters at the border. And so what I was trying to say is that with the diversification of the nationalities coming to the border, there may be more people coming from countries for which asylum recognition rates are higher. So somebody who's coming from Venezuela on average is likely to be successful in their asylum claim because they're fleeing a repressive government. They very well may have a political opinion that leads them to face persecution, which is one of the grounds for asylum. Whereas somebody coming from Mexico who might be fleeing gang violence, or they might be coming for economic reasons, their reasons for migration are less likely to lead to a successful asylum claim. In the other countries, I don't have the exact numbers, but it really is a very diverse set of people. There's, like I said, there's sizable numbers from South American countries such as Ecuador and Colombia and Brazil. But there are also small slices of numbers from all around the world, from Turkey, India, China, Romania, Russia, Cameroon, Afghanistan, like just a very wide variety of countries. Some of those countries, again, represent people who are fleeing pretty clear persecution on recognized grounds in our asylum law, and some of those people are fleeing for reasons that might be economic or other fleeing kinds of danger that aren't well recognized in our asylum laws.
Okay, let's thank our speaker for the wonderful